April 1942. Brussels, Belgium. The streets are quiet, almost too quiet for a city that is under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. Inside a small, unassuming workshop on Rue de Tanneurs, Marie sits at a sewing machine, her hands moving with practiced precision. The rhythmic hum of the needle is a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside, where the shadow of war looms over every corner, every alley. Marie doesn't yet know it, but this simple act, stitching fabric, will soon intertwine her fate with that of men whose lives are hanging by a thread. For now, it is just another morning in the war-torn city, another day spent crafting garments that the occupation doesn't seem to notice. She takes a deep breath, eyes flicking momentarily to the window, where the sound of marching boots passes by. Life goes on, or at least it must. Her small shop had always been a quiet place, hidden in plain sight, a corner of the city where people could come to have their clothes altered or repaired. The work was mundane, routine, a seamstress life of stitching, hemming, and patching. But the war had made everything feel different. The air was thick with fear, and though Marie tried to remain neutral, there was no denying the sense of impending danger that clung to the city like a second skin. It was on a day like this, a day that had started like any other, that the letter arrived. She had no idea how it had been delivered, whether by hand or by courier, but the heavy, square envelope was unmistakable. There were no stamps, no markings, just her name, written in neat, unassuming handwriting. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the paper within. The note was brief, but made her blood run cold. It wasn't a letter, not exactly, but a request, no, a command, a simple plea, and yet something far more dangerous beneath it. You will be required to alter certain garments. The details will follow. Do not ask questions. The lives of many depend on you. No signature, no explanation, just a chillingly clear demand. Marie had no idea who the letter was from, but she knew well enough not to question it. The war had created 1,000 different ways people had to navigate the world without asking too many questions. It was all about survival, both physical and moral. Days passed, and then the first visitor arrived. A man, tall, dressed in an oversized coat that seemed too large for him, entered the shop. His eyes darted around the room nervously, as though looking for something he might have missed. He introduced himself as Paul, though Marie had no reason to believe that was his real name. In the world they now lived in, names were often as false as the identities people were forced to create in order to survive. Paul didn't speak much. His presence was a bit unsettling, yet somehow it didn't seem entirely out of place. He had the aura of someone who was used to moving in the shadows, someone who understood the importance of silence. He came straight to the point. "I need your help," he said quietly, his voice low and deliberate. "There are certain men, British airmen, who need to escape. They are being hunted, and we have a way to get them out. But we need your skills." Marie hesitated, her needle hovering in mid-air as she processed his words. She could feel her heart begin to race. Her mind was screaming to refuse, to close the door and pretend this never happened. But something held her back. A deep, unsettling sense of inevitability settled in her stomach. This was no coincidence. The letter, the visitor, this was happening for a reason. She had no choice but to play her part. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man handed her a coat. It was well worn, probably from one of the airmen, though it looked ordinary enough. The only thing that struck her as odd was the lining. It seemed heavier than it should be, the fabric a bit too thick for a coat. As she ran her hands over it, she felt the subtle indentation of what could only be described as a map, an intricate, hand-drawn map of the region, lines and routes marked in careful detail. Her heart skipped a beat. Paul's eyes bore into hers. "You will sew the map into the lining," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Make sure no one notices. It could mean the difference between life and death for them." Marie swallowed hard. She had heard of such things, of people smuggling maps, messages, even weapons under the noses of the occupiers. But she had never imagined that she would become part of such an operation. She had always thought of herself as an observer, someone who watched history unfold from a distance, sewing the fabric of ordinary lives. She never thought she'd be asked to stitch the very fabric of escape itself. But now she was. As Paul left, promising to return for the coat, Marie stood there, the map still pressed against her fingers. She felt the weight of what she had just agreed to, though she knew she could never turn back. The choice had been made for her the moment that letter arrived. The war had found her, as it had found so many others. And in this moment, she had become a part of something much bigger than herself, something terrifying and life-altering. Over the next several weeks, Marie sewed, tirelessly, secretly, one coat after another. She worked in silence, threading the maps into the linings with the precision of someone who had no time to waste. She worked late into the night, often by candlelight, her hands moving almost instinctively as she sewed the thin pieces of fabric into the inner layers of each coat. The faces of the airmen, she imagined, would never know her. They would never see her as they passed by, running for their lives, their fates depending on a few careful stitches. But for her, each coat was a small act of resistance, a quiet defiance against the madness that had consumed the world. Still, as she finished each one, a nagging thought lingered. What if they were caught? What if she was caught? The Gestapo had eyes everywhere, ears everywhere. One wrong move, one careless mistake, and it would all be over. She couldn't afford to slip up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. And so she sewed on. Alone. Unknown. Her quiet work might never make the history books, but in the shadows, where the war raged without mercy, her hands wove a thread of hope into the fabric of escape. June 1942. Brussels, Belgium. The city had changed in ways Marie could not ignore. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension, a constant, suffocating reminder that life was no longer as it had once been. The streets felt more dangerous, the faces around her more suspicious. The war, which had once seemed distant and remote, had become an omnipresent force, a shadow that loomed over every action, every choice. In the quiet of her shop, Marie worked, her hands moving over fabric with the same practiced ease as always. But nothing felt the same. The coats piled up around her, each one more urgent than the last. She sewed quickly, threading the hidden maps into their linings with precision, her hands steady despite the turmoil within her. Each coat was another small victory, another life saved. But with every stitch, the risk grew. The men who had come to her were a part of something bigger now, something far more dangerous. And Marie had become entangled in it, unwillingly but irrevocably. There were whispers of the Gestapo closing in on their network, of spies in the streets, of the looming danger of betrayal. Marie no longer worked alone. The man who had first brought the coats to her, Paul, returned more frequently now. His visits were brief, his instructions curt. He was more cautious than before, his eyes always scanning the street outside, as if the walls themselves were listening. There was something urgent in his manner now, something more frantic in his every move. One afternoon, as Marie was finishing up the stitching on a particularly difficult coat, Paul appeared in the doorway, his face pale. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the piles of coats before he stepped inside. "They're closing in," he said quietly, his voice low and strained. "We've heard reports. The Gestapo is getting closer. If we don't move these men soon, it could be too late." Marie's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy fog. She had known that there was always the possibility of discovery, that the work she was doing could be uncovered. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the fear in his voice, made the danger all too real. Paul stepped closer, holding up another coat. This one was different, darker, with a heavier fabric, the kind worn by officers. "This one is for a high-ranking officer who's been helping us," he explained. "He'll be leaving the city soon, and we need to make sure that map gets into his hands." Marie took the coat from him, her fingers trembling as she ran them over the lining. It was a more complex map than the other she had sewn. The routes it depicted were more intricate, the stakes much higher. She knew that once the map was sewn in, the officer would be on his way, and there would be no turning back. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet fear she couldn't conceal. "What if we're caught?" Paul's expression softened for a moment, though his eyes remained guarded. "If we don't do this, if we don't keep helping, all of this, everything, will have been for nothing. These men, they'll be caught, and will be no better than the rest of them, standing by while innocent people die." Marie looked down at the coat in her hands, the heavy weight of it suddenly becoming more than just fabric. It was a symbol of the risk, the cost. A piece of clothing, a simple thing, could mean the difference between life and death. The thought of sewing it into place, of completing the task, was overwhelming. Yet, she knew there was no choice. Not anymore. She had stepped into this world, and now she was bound to it. As she worked through the night, the sound of the sewing machine filling the small, dimly lit room, Marie found herself caught between two conflicting worlds. On the one hand, there was the fear, the very real fear of being discovered, of the Gestapo showing up at her door, of everything she had worked for coming undone in an instant. On the other hand, there was something else, something that kept her going, the knowledge that her actions, however small, could make a difference. That by sewing these maps, by helping these men escape, she was doing something more than simply surviving. She was resisting. The night stretched on, and as the hours passed, Marie grew more tired, more focused. The map was almost complete, its lines now hidden beneath layers of fabric. The coat would soon be ready, and the officer would soon be on his way. The sense of urgency grew with every passing minute, a relentless drumbeat that echoed in her mind. When the coat was finally finished, Paul arrived once more, his face drawn and tense. Without a word, he took the coat from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the work she had done. "It's done," he said. "We'll send it off tonight." Marie nodded, her hand still trembling, but she said nothing. She simply watched as Paul left, disappearing into the shadows, carrying with him the product of her labor. The room felt emptier now, the silence heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. For the next few days, Marie continued her work, though the weight of what she had done seemed to settle more heavily on her. There were fewer visits now, fewer coats to sew, and the ones that arrived were more urgent, more desperate. The network she had become a part of was shrinking, the walls closing in. There were rumors of betrayals, of cracks in their ranks, of informants feeding information to the Gestapo. The fear that had always been there was becoming something much more tangible, something that Marie could feel creeping closer with every passing day. One evening, as she was finishing up another coat, she heard a knock at the door. It was sharp, urgent, a sound she had come to dread. Her heart raced as she stood up and walked toward the door. She knew that at any moment, her life could change. That knock could be the end of everything. When she opened the door, it wasn't Paul. It wasn't anyone she recognized. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood there, dressed in a dark coat, his face shadowed. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. The fear in Marie's chest constricted painfully. She had heard stories of the Gestapo's brutality, of their ability to strike terror into even the bravest hearts. But as the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, Marie's heart skipped. There was no gun, no violent threat, just a letter, sealed, marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. She hesitated, but then took the envelope. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but she knew this was the moment. Everything she had done, everything she had risked, was about to be tested. And yet, as she closed the door behind her, the weight of the unknown pressed down harder than ever before. September 1944. Brussels, Belgium. The city had changed again. The Allies had retaken the city, their tanks rumbling through the streets, their soldiers flooding into the once dreaded neighborhood. But for Marie, the victory felt hollow, distant. The war was over for the city, but it was not over for her, not by a long shot. In the weeks since the liberation, the streets had erupted with celebration. Flags waved, and the air was thick with the sound of triumph. The German occupiers had been pushed out, their grip loosened, their authority shattered. People came out of hiding, their faces now unmasked, their fears of betrayal and capture dissipating in the wave of Allied power. But as the people of Brussels reveled in their freedom, Marie could not bring herself to join them. She had no desire to be part of their celebrations, no interest in the grand speeches or the medals that were handed out in the town squares. The truth was, for her, the war had never been about grand victories or public glory. It had always been about the small, quiet acts of resistance, the ones that no one saw, the ones that no one would ever acknowledge. She had been a part of something bigger than herself, but that something had now disappeared into the chaos of the war's end. The people who had passed through her shop, the airmen who had worn the coats she had sewn, were now gone. Some had escaped, some had been captured, and some had simply disappeared into the fog of wartime uncertainty. She never knew their fates, never saw their faces again. She often wondered about them, if they were still alive, if they had made it out of occupied Europe, if they had found safety, but none of that mattered anymore. The work she had done, quiet, unnoticed, was now a distant memory, a small footnote in the story of a war that was already fading from public consciousness. Marie walked through the streets of Brussels, tried to avoid the celebrations that seemed to be everywhere. The clinking of glasses, the cheers, the shouts of victory, they all felt like a distant echo to her. She had seen too much, experienced too much, to ever truly be part of that noise. She had played her role, and now it was time to disappear. But as she made her way home, she passed a small shop, a place that had once been familiar to her. It was a bookstore, old and dusty, the shelves stacked high with books that no one seemed to read anymore. She had visited it many times before the war, looking for novels or histories, always seeking something to distract her from the world outside. The shop had been closed for most of the occupation, the owner having fled when the Germans arrived. But now, the shop was open again. On impulse, Marie stepped inside. The familiar scent of old paper and ink hit her immediately, and for a moment, it felt as though she had stepped back in time. The war seemed a distant memory, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. The bookstore owner, a thin man with gray hair and tired eyes, greeted her with a wary smile. He didn't recognize her. No one ever did after all this time. She was just another face in a crowd of strangers now, a nameless survivor of a war that had claimed so much and left so little in its wake. "I haven't seen you in a long time," the owner said, his voice soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I thought perhaps you had disappeared." Marie smiled faintly, a gesture of sadness more than joy. "No, I've been here, just keeping to myself." The man nodded, as though he understood, and gestured to the shelves. "The war's over now, but the world is still changing. There are things you might want to read." Marie looked at the books, her eyes scanning the titles, but nothing seemed to interest her. Everything felt irrelevant. The world had moved on, and she had no place in it anymore. Her part in the war, the quiet work of sewing maps into coats, was over, erased by the passage of time and the complexity of history. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on a small display near the door. It was a collection of wartime memoirs, books about the resistance, the liberation, the stories of those who had fought and died. She hesitated for a moment, and then, on impulse, she picked up one of the books. The cover was simple, unremarkable, but the title caught her attention: Heroes of the Resistance.